Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan, and I'm absolutely delighted to have an old friend and colleague, Frederick Clarkson, with me today on the influence continuum. Frederick has written about politics and religion for 4 decades. His work has appeared in a wide range of publications from Mother Jones, Church and State, Ms. Magazine to the Christian Science Monitor, Salon.com, and Religion Dispatches. He's worked as an investigative editor at Planned Parenthood Federation of America, as communications director at the Institute for Democracy Studies, and co-founded the group blog Talk to Action. He is the author, co-author, or editor of several books, including Dispatches from the Religious Left, The Future of Faith and Politics in America, and my favorite, Eternal Hostility, The Struggle Between Theocracy and Democracy. He's currently a senior research analyst at Political Research Associates, a progressive think tank in Somerville, Massachusetts. Frederick Clarkson, we go back decades, and I think we talked maybe in the late 80s about the Moonies, maybe earlier, but you are so bright and you've spent so much time especially researching the issue of religious freedom, and it's especially important in 2022 to help the public, I think, and I think you do too, to understand more about what's going on politically with the forces that are trying to move the conversation away from pluralistic democratic traditions to something more extreme. And before I ask my first question, I just want to thank you for all your help. You helped me tremendously when I was researching the cult of Trump, but you've also helped educate me about issues around religious freedom. For example, when I was out of the Moonies talking about mind control and brainwashing and such, it was you who said, you know, Steve, the Moonies really violated your religious freedom as a Jew when they lied to you and said they weren't part of a religious group. And then you wound up, Steve, 2 weeks later bowing to an altar with Moon's picture on it, thinking he's the Messiah. And we're in the last days of 1977, was going to be Armageddon. And here we are in 2022. So with that as a setup, Fred, there's so much going on right now. And in particular, you've been writing about the local level of activism. And we've talked before about Project Blitz, and you've been involved with Blitz Watch. And I want to start by asking you to talk about the Colorado school, committee and meetings and the agenda, and start there for our conversation today. Thanks.
Well, sure. Before we get there, a couple of things I want to say about our earlier meetings, and that's
Okay,
that,
great.
and that's that. I recall, I think the first time we met in person, it was at a cult awareness conference of some kind, and I didn't know who you were, but there was a couple of hundred people in this room, and some big plenary session. And you stood out to me because you were, it was a room of, parents and ex-members and helping profession people, all good, well-intended people. But you stood up for the former members, saying it's time to stop treating them as victims and damaged people, right? And that, they can't be defined by their cult experience alone. It's about becoming who you're going to be and not focusing always on who you were. And that was an important moment for me. And I think you were the only voice of that kind speaking at that conference. So everybody else was very forgettable, but not you.
Well, thank you for reminding me of that, because it's something that I felt very strongly. Like, good little ex-member, let us psychologists and psychiatrists tell you about what mind control is. And I was like, wait a minute, I researched this. But now it's 45 years later, Fred, and I have a doctorate that I did
Hmm.
my whole dissertation on undue influence in the law. So I'm getting a lot more respect in the last year than I've ever had, and it feels
Hmm.
great that I'm actually a scholar, activist, practitioner now. So thank you
Well,
for that.
much deserved recognition, Steve. I'll say one other thing about you, but also all the others, right? And that is that nobody understands religious freedom better than people who've never had it, right? And now do, or people who had it taken away from them, but they got it back.
Oh, this is so important. What you just said is so precious because I did lose my freedom of myself, and this whole notion that of disinformation. Oh, religion is a slippery slope, and mind control can't be defined. I'm like, wait a minute. My rights were violated because I didn't have informed consent. I was lied to. So, therefore, this was not
Mhm.
a healthy religious activity that I was the victim of. This was a mind controlled political religious cult with an agenda to destroy democracy in America. I didn't know that until like months later.
Right.
But I actually believed democracy was satanic, and Richard Nixon needed to stay president during Watergate because God said so. And how did I believe that? Because Moon said it. And I was just like programmed to listen to him.
Mhm. And all this is a great setup for the things we are going to talk about
Yep.
because it all relates strongly. But it's I think it's also true that what was I going to say here? Better pause on this while I think about what it was.
Okay.
But um,
I'll write it down. It's not a problem.
mhm. The well, it'll come back. Not important.
Okay, well,
Mhm.
we were
We can,
talking about, standing up, and people who've lost their religious freedom can really
oh
appreciate
yeah.
when we're born.
Okay. Here's what it is. The other part is that this is framed solely in terms of religion, when in fact you taught me that cults are not about religion. They're about a series of tactics that are used to gain control of people, to manipulate them, to con them out of their personal beliefs and to turn them to somebody else's beliefs. That's where the violation takes place, right?
Yep,
But those same tactics, if they were used to fleece you out of your money or your property, right, would be crimes.
correct.
So as a society, we haven't done a very good job of reconciling these things. As you say, people say, oh, religion can't touch that. Well, religion can be used to cloak many things. And that's what cults do. But that's what some of the theocratic political movements we're going to be talking about do too.
Yep.
People who are intent on depriving people of their religious freedom and their democracy.
Right. And I can't help but interject, if I may, Fred,
Mhm.
that it was only after the Fraser investigation, the subcommittee, the House subcommittee investigation into Korean CIA activities that I was an expert witness for, and after Jonestown, all the assassination of Leo Ryan and so many wonderful people, that I realized that actually my cult was an operation of the CIA and the Korean CIA to counter North Korean communist brainwashing. And I realized, oh, like I'm an MK Ultra 3.0 type of person who was ready to die or kill on command for God, when in fact my brain had been hacked.
Brain hacking is a is a big part of the issue, isn't it?
Yep. So let's go back to what's happening with Project Blitz and Colorado school board races, and you've written some excellent pieces in Religious Dispatches. So please educate us.
Well, as you know, I've been working on theocratic political movements, Unification Church included, but also Christian theocratic political movements for a long time.
Hmm.
And some of them have come to great maturity in our time, politically speaking. They're not always hacking people's minds, but they have successfully managed to learn how to use democratic electoral processes in order to erode and to end it.
Mm.
And many people will be familiar with the rise of confrontational politics in school boards in the past year or so. Excuse me. This is not an accident, and it's not and it didn't come out of nowhere. It's a nationally coordinated effort with lots of moving parts. One of those parts I looked at in Colorado, because there's a Dominionist, and we can talk about what that is in a minute, a Bible college called Charis Bible College that's operated by this guy named Andrew Womack, who has a political and broadcasting operation called the Truth and Liberty Coalition. So anybody's familiar with Pat Robertson and his school and his broadcasting efforts can see what's going on with Andrew Womack and this smaller religious political empire fairly clearly. But what his college does is it teaches what's called how to conquer the 7 mountains of dominion. And dominion is a theocratic Christian idea, and that is that Christians are, it's your mission in life, and conservative Christians of the right sort, to take control of society, in this case in 7 pieces. Right, the 7 mountains, the metaphorical. Other metaphors are gates, and there are a number of them that are used, but they all mean the same thing. The 7 mountains, as Andrew Womack teaches at his college, are government, religion, family, education, media, arts and entertainment, and business. And in the school, unlike in traditional liberal arts college, you might pick a major. In this case, you're going to pick a mountain. It's going to be your focus in your life. And as a part of all this, there's practicum kinds of things. And in what they did last year was to begin to get their 3rd-year students in government, and presumably in education, to mobilize with the Truth and Liberty Coalition to recruit and train candidates for school board in Colorado, which had sort of off-year set of school board elections, which was intended as a pilot project that would be taken certainly statewide this year and perhaps nationally, depending on who they can get involved. And they held a training conference that brought 1,000 people to Charis Bible College in Woodland Park, which is just outside Colorado Springs. And they fielded slates of candidates. And what was interesting about them is that they had voter guides, just like many Christian right and many other groups have voter guides, and had only 5 issues. You think of school boards as about curriculum and budgets, and whether to build a new bathroom on the 2nd floor of the elementary school, that kind of stuff. Right. But they had 5 issues: critical race theory, parental rights, boys playing girls sports. That's the way they've had it, girls sports, sex education, and gender identity pronouns.
So they set the agenda, in other words, for these so-called candidates that they were then training and running, and I assume well-funded campaigns compared to any normal school board committee type of thing. But before we go further, I just want to state categorically that I have friends who are conservative Orthodox Christians who definitively trash Dominionism theologically as non-Christian, that they quote Jesus saying, "My kingdom is not of this world," or "render unto, Caesar what was Caesar's." I'm misquoting the Bible now, but the idea is money and God do not mix, and yet Dominionism is all about political power and money. So I just wanted to state categorically that this theological perspective is in the minority, except it's well funded for political gains, at least from my point of view.
Yeah, how the numbers and percentages break out, I don't know, because Dominionism is a series of ideas, right? Mm-hmm. Like any other set of ideas, liberalism, Marxism, you name it, right? And conservatism. And it's a set of ideas that has percolated through evangelical Christianity in particular, but not only evangelical Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's percolated into Catholicism and mainline Christianity and Orthodox as well. Mm-hmm. So this idea of expressing oneself and exerting oneself politically is not unique to Dominionists either, or conservatives. Right. So I think, and they have every right to do these things, right? And
Can I interrupt one more second, Fred? Forgive me, but
right.
Is it not true that when Trump came in, he signed some executive order saying something like it's okay for churches to do outright political campaigning, or am I misunderstanding or misremembering?
Well, that's kind of the intent, but what he did was he said that he was going to overturn what's known as the Johnson Amendment. Mm-hmm. And what they're referring to there is a provision, excuse me, of the IRS tax code for nonprofits that, I have to do this again, sorry. That prescribes as a condition of your federal tax exemption electoral involvement. You can either advance or oppose candidates for public office. You can as individuals, but you can't use tax-exempt funds, right? Or the positions of authority in the church to electioneer. Mm-hmm. That's something that applies not just to churches, but all religious institutions, and for that matter, all nonprofit organizations. Your local Shakespeare company can't do, has the same prescription. So, Lyndon Johnson, when he was in the Senate, was the person who amended the tax code to do this. And so Trump was going to find a way to repeal the Johnson Amendment, which he did not do.
I see.
However, not unique to Trump, but he made a big show of it. It's a provision that's actually rarely and barely enforced.
It just seems like it got ramped up dramatically in the last 5 years to me, that churches and temples and other religious institutions have gotten much more political. But that's just my.
It goes back farther, but yeah, there's as a matter of there's a boldness and there's a greater practice, right? Mm-hmm. Because of there's a lot less fear that people are going to lose their tax exemption over electioneering, because the IRS just doesn't do much about it. I
see. Please continue. And I apologize for the interruption.
No, it's quite all right. It's a conversation. So this is a pilot project in Colorado of running candidates for school board, and they did very well. I think I wrote down the number here. I think there were 21 candidates won in a handful of school board races that took place in Colorado last fall. And these were people who, their candidates needed to be 100%ers on those 5 questions, right? Mm-hmm. So they took 4 school districts outright, which is pretty good for a first outing for mm-hmm. a group that had never run candidates for anything before.
Right.
So, but we saw similar kinds of things happening all over the country. And this is an intention to, excuse me again, to really activate, people at the most grassroots level, people interested in the public schools, and getting them all churned up about non-issues or things that are barely an issue, getting people angry and mobilizing the turnout to take over school boards because public schools are allegedly teaching wrong things. Mm-hmm. This is building the far-right base of the Christian right and the Dominionists, but also what we call the Patriot movement, which are far-right groups, not necessarily white supremacists, but they're anti-government, tax protester kinds of people. Mm-hmm. And together, the Dominionists and the Patriot movement kinds of people were the very people who showed up on January 6th by the busload. Mm-hmm. They're mobilized in that way as anti-government people, as anti-state people, to the point where they're that confrontational with government at all levels. So going back to the idea that it's not always about taking over government buildings, but that taking over government institutions is a key thing. So this alliance between anti-government patriot movement and the increasingly anti-government Dominionist movement is a pretty fresh development in American politics, and one that has proven to be effective at the grassroots level, as we saw in Colorado, but in many places around the country.
Yeah, it's very concerning. My former cult, the Moonies, had Sean Moon, head of the Rod of Iron ministry, that says we all need AR-15 assault rifles, and has two compounds, went January 6th and was broadcasting disinformation about Antifa, as well as the Mooney newspaper, the Washington Times, is saying, oh, it's Antifa that's trying to do violence on our Capitol, not the Trumpers. And I recently saw a video of Sean Moon at a local meeting talking about how much he loves America and democracy and how we're free. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, you liar. I know the teachings that you have and your father had very well, and you're just conning people. And people were clapping when he said, I love America. It's like, excuse me?
Yeah, you sent me that video, and I was struck by how he was comparing the routine processes of school governance and what's taught in the schools as creeping communism.
Yes.
And this is, but it's not. I mean, he has the Moon Organization roots that you're very familiar with, but this is the same kind of stuff that Andrew Womack and the Dominionists are saying too.
Right.
The idea of, I mean, there are many interrelated ideas here, but one of them is the idea of secular government. Now, secular doesn't necessarily mean anti-religion, right? It only means that government is neutral when it comes to the people of a variety of faiths. And they're not there to represent one or another, or even religion itself, but to apply the laws and the policies of government at all levels equitably.
Yep.
But they don't want that. That's exactly what they're opposed to. They want certain sects or coalitions of sects to be the leading voice, the governing voice, even the totalitarian voice in society.
Yeah, it's elitism masquerading as popularism. How it seems to me.
It is, and so people who don't conform to whatever parameters they've set, are second-class citizens at best.
Right.
Now, in the more serious theological views that undergird Dominionism, being a member of the wrong religion, is a capital offense if you follow, the capital offenses in the Old Testament. If you support democratic pluralism, or that's potentially idolatry.
Yeah.
If you support the idea of secular publication, or heaven forbid, teaching about the complicated history of race in America, that's a sin against God. It makes you an enemy of God.
So they say, but it's
to be dealt with accordingly.
Yeah, it's totalitarianism. I need to share a direct experience I had with Sun Myung Moon, where he said, when we take power in America, we have to amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense for people who have sex outside of their unification marriages, and how we would be doing people a favor by taking them away from their physical bodies and sending them to the spirit world so they wouldn't sin anymore. And I was so indoctrinated. I was like, yes, Father, we have to do mass genocide. I didn't say genocide, but that's the implication, is like,
Sure.
You either convert to our way or you're done. Your life's over.
Yeah, and in the Dominionist theology of Christian Reconstructionism, where they're listing, the Old Testament capital offenses, adultery is certainly one of them. Now, one thing to keep in mind in all this is that radical, hang 'em high theocracy is not breaking out any minute. And even the theologians of Christian Reconstructionism don't approve of that. They don't. The theologians R.J. Rushdoony and Gary North and others see it as a long-term process. They see people as having to have embraced the whole Word of God in themselves before it can become expressed in government and public policy, which doesn't sound so bad, right? And because they understand that it might take thousands or tens of thousands of years to get there. They understand that human change and informed religious change can take a real long time. And no matter which religion that you come from, that's pretty much understood. Although there are people who we would call accelerationists, right? People who are saying, no, we don't need to wait that long. There's things that we can do in the here and now. And those are the kinds of people who gave us January 6th.
Yeah, but I really want to pick your brain on Gary North, who I did not realize was married to Rushdoony's daughter and was a big libertarian in Austrian economics, and Ron Paul worked for Ron Paul, and to me it connects the dots with Christian right, the way I think about it, and libertarianism and sovereign citizen ideology. Please share what you think we should know about Mr. North.
Well, yeah, Gary North was a prolific author and writer and behind-the-scenes political strategist. Mm-hmm. And he knew, just as Rushdoony knew, I mean, the reason you've never heard of Gary North, right, is because he likes it that way. He understood, as Rushdoony understood, that what they were proposing was so revolutionary, so threatening to the powers that be, including the evangelical powers that be, right, the denominational kinds of people, that they had to move in quiet ways. Mm-hmm. One time, Gary North was caught donating all of his books to a university library and pretending to be an alumnus. Lots of subtle ways of getting into the culture. Seeping ideas into a culture is a revolutionary act. So as he understood, there are lots of people who've been influenced by Reconstructionist ideas who don't even know that that's happened. Mm-hmm. And there was one famous, at least in literature about these things, episode, is some people, you and I are old enough to remember the 1980 Republican convention in Texas, that nominated Ronald Reagan. Well, after he was nominated, he went to a nearby meeting of what was organized by the Religious Roundtable. Thousands and thousands of evangelical leaders and pastors, all cheering, for this new leader in Ronald Reagan, who's famously said, you can't endorse me, but I endorse you. Now, Gary North was there, and he'd been arranged for him to speak there, and he talked to another guy and said, this is just an astounding thing. All of these people, we've been on the political sidelines for a generation, and now suddenly they're engaged in electoral politics, and they don't even know how they got there. Mm-hmm. And the guy standing next to him was one of the founders of Moral Majority, said, yeah, that's true. They don't know, but we do. That's the power of ideas, and the way that this particular vision of a reconstructed society is so politically animating. It's one thing to be a Christian conservative. It's another reason to know why, right? What God requires, right? Of conservative Christians in that regard. You could talk about Christian nationalism until you're blue in the face, but if you had a Christian nation, what exactly would that entail? Christian Reconstructionism, what we also call Dominionism, gives them puts the meat on those bones, right? Yeah. Tells you this is what it is. These are our goals. It may take some time to get there, but this is where we're going. And that's why what's happening in Colorado is so concerning. Taking over these small scale institutions of government and mobilizing like-minded people to begin to set aside what we've worked for hundreds of years to achieve in creating a more equal and just society and turning it more in their direction. This is a turning point in the institutions of education, but also in electoral democracy. Swamping low turnout school board races. And isn't that a scandal that school board races are low turnout? Why in our communities, don't we treat that with great seriousness as one of the most important things that we can be concerned about? So
that's a very important question, and it's a call to action for anyone listening to this to really start looking around locally, and especially if you're a parent, and get involved and get educated, because in my understanding is there are very wealthy, powerful forces, and including enemies of the United States, who would like to see more polarization and inner conflict in the United States, are wanting to instigate these types of things. And now we're seeing this anti-election federal election law, the John Lewis Act, activity to try to undo federal election security.
Well, that's right. And, I think a lot of what's happened across our lifetime, and maybe before as well, we don't have to blame our generation for everything, but, we've taken a lot for granted, and democracy is fragile and it's hard, right? What was called the American experiment at the beginning is still an experiment. And from the beginning, and as we see now, there are people who didn't like the experiment when it got started and still don't like it and are opposed to it, right? And that's the other piece. That's one of the pieces about Gary North. He is not just a theologian and but a political strategist. And he has a phrase that always stuck with me that describes this as, excuse me, the dilemma of democratic pluralism. And what the dilemma of democratic pluralism is that those of us who support the idea of democratic pluralism, equality under the law, that people of different faiths have the same rights under the law, that philosophy, that undergirding idea in American culture and politics and governance, is that we have to tolerate, as a matter of our own philosophy, the very ideas and people who are opposed to that philosophy, right?
Yep.
And so the dilemma is, what do we do about that? What do we do when there are cults like Sun Myung Moon's cult, or January 6th insurrectionists who were a long time coming before they came to Washington, right? What do we do with those kinds of ideas and those kinds of people? People have a right to their beliefs and to most of their political actions. Where are lines drawn? And when you do draw them, how do you confront that? What do you actually do? That's the dilemma for us, and what's hard about democracy is we have to know that, as Jefferson and Madison and those guys, knew at the beginning, that the monarchists and the theocrats would be back, and they are, right? And this entire structure of Americans' governments, the direction it was intended when they got things started, was to try to inoculate our society against those things as best they could. But they knew, and we're seeing right now, it's all very fragile, and it takes being alert. And I guess my recommendation, as long as we're talking about these things, is to not only be aware, but begin to learn about these things, because we're consumers of too much television, too much sports, too many movies, too much popular culture, and not enough of democracy and its institutions.
Yeah, totally. And I want to come back to what you were saying earlier about this college in Colorado having the money and organizing conferences to train activists, basically, to coach them on what are the hot button ideas that they think that are winners for them to try to push their way in. And I don't see any type of organized effort. Maybe it's out there, but I'm not seeing as big an effort, or as broad an effort as needed.
Well, this has been the story of the development of the Christian right in the United States. The kinds of things I've been saying about, identifying electoral politics as a way in, right?
Yep.
The people who are opposed to democracy are the ones who are mastering the tools of democracy itself in order to gain control of their institutions, to either co-opt them to their purposes or to erode or to end them altogether. Public education being a key target. Gary North and people of his ilk see education as an institution that's controlled by Satan. If you're not in a Christian school of the right sort or a homeschool, we're taught by parents of the right sort, you're getting a wrong education, one that's what makes you an enemy of God. They don't want to use taxpayer funds to train up the enemies of God.
Yeah, very important point. And Catherine Stewart, I want to do a shout out on her excellent research and books on the whole co-opting of the education system, by the Christian right. Please continue.
Yeah, just to continue with the shout out, people often ask me, what in the world can we do? Coming off of this podcast,
Right.
what in the world can we do, Stephen? Come on. So one of the things that I recommend is that we have to have enough common knowledge and enough common vocabulary to even have thoughtful conversations about these things.
Right.
And so because that's it's a lot of big, complicated stuff with law and psychology and religion and all these complicated slippery slopes that nobody wants to deal with. My recommendation is to read one book in common. And I recommend reading Catherine Stewart's book, The Power Worshippers, because that has enough of what we need in terms of a knowledge base and a vocabulary base to really begin to grasp these things in a more thoroughgoing way and to come up with some democratic answers.
Yeah, I love your Eternal Hostility book, and I know you're working on a new book on religious freedom. So I want to do a shout out for you to get a great publisher and get this book written. I also want you to just comment, because you're the one who taught me this when I was researching the cult of Trump, about the Manhattan Declaration and just what an incredible change that was. Could you share with our listeners what?
Yeah, sure. Just a note of history on that. It's way back in the 80s.
Yeah.
When a lot of the theological changes were taking place that allowed the Christian right to form. One of the key thinkers was this guy named Francis Schaeffer. He was mostly known for his theology of anti-abortionism, but if you were an anti-abortion political operative, it's like, how do you get enough political power, enough strength to overturn abortion? And the problem that they had was that evangelicals, and particularly the Baptists and the Catholics, didn't trust each other, hated each other. In some parts of the world, we're still killing each other. And so what Schaeffer said is, we need what he called co-belligerency. And that is, we don't have to agree on everything, right? But we do agree on certain things. And in this case, it was abortion, but also the institutions that support abortion rights. Mm-hmm. So you started to see, Catholic cardinals sitting very uncomfortable on the same stage with the Jerry Falwell kinds of people, and but that matured to the point where some key thinkers put together what was the Manhattan Declaration, and this was a result of a series of conversations between even conservative evangelicals and conservative Catholics, where they could figure out, what they could agree to disagree on, but how to agree and what to agree on. And they ended up with this statement that was signed by 50 sitting Catholic prelates, right, and leaders of the Christian right, and even some institutional evangelicals like Al Mohler, who was the president of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And there were three things that they came to agree on: life, marriage, and religious freedom, in that order. And that pretty soon you began to see all the websites changing on the Christian right, even the website of the Catholic bishops. It was about those three things. And the most remarkable public spectacle we had of that was when Mitt Romney gave his acceptance speech at the Republican convention. And he specifically stated those three things as a part of his agenda: life, marriage, and religious freedom. Said the Mormon,
Right.
and who needed to appeal to these constituencies. He knew what they wanted, what they needed to hear from him, and he gave it to them. This is the part of the key story of the politics of our time. When the leader of the Republican Party, specifically states the key points of the agenda of the Christian right, is just a remarkable thing. And so we still see these elements of conservative Catholicism, including the bishops and key elements of the Christian right, putting people like Donald Trump in power.
So I want to just for our listeners' sake say my understanding of those three things are against women's right to choose, to have control over their own bodies regarding abortion, for example.
Sure.
The right for gay people to get married and raise children, that they were against. And in terms of religious freedom, their rights to discriminate against anyone else who has a different religious view than them. Did I get it pretty correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And they have their own definitions of these things, obviously, but I wanted to say exactly what they were, I wanted to quote it.
Right.
And to understand those are the words that they give to their agenda, but we know what the agenda is.
Right. So give us some more hopeful things that we can do, because so many people are like so overloaded and so stressed out and anxious about what's happening in the world and the environment, etc. But there's a lot of great, smart people with resources, but they're not working together in a coordinated way to counter the threat to democracy that's so blatantly in our faces right now.
Well, that's true. That's why I say, first we need to know something in order to have a conversation about it. Read Catherine Stewart's book, The Power Worshippers. And while they're at it, The Cult of Trump is helpful as well. So
thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome. And but just don't have to read just one or two books. Reading books is good.
Yes.
So and talking about them, that's one thing I know has been going on in the age of coronavirus, and as authors couldn't do public events. And suddenly reading groups popped up. I know Catherine Stewart, has been speaking to people, to groups of, reading groups who have read her book, and these are the kinds, I know Catherine would be willing to do more of those. I'm sure you would too.
I've been doing lots of smaller talks when people are hungry and are wanting to learn.
And this is the thing. I think that as we feel helpless in the face of all these things, we do have to understand that an awful lot of people are, just as you said, hungry to learn. They want to understand these things. And being given the pablum that we're often given by publishers and publications and our political leaders, we have to demand better and we have to demand more. It's not enough to talk, to tiptoe around the social conservatives. Come on. We're talking about people who oppose democracy and are taking visible, public, unambiguous action against it.
Right. 100%.
So what does that mean? We then have to know enough ourselves, right? Not just about, the book learning stuff, but about how electoral democracy works in our own communities. I learned that lesson myself some years ago. I was supporting a candidate. I hadn't been involved much in electoral politics myself at that point. We were standing at this island intersection, in a busy place in town during rush hour, holding our signs. But these were very politically aware people in a university town. I knew all about what was going on with the Iraq War at the time. But I soon discovered that we all knew more about what was happening in the green zone in Baghdad than we did about how to elect candidates for public office. There are details, how they're in our area. There's regulations about, well, how big a sign can you have? Can you put it on a stick? If you put it in the ground, how far from the curb? What do you do with them after the election? When is the voter registration deadline? How do you get an absentee ballot? When do you have to have those in? Those are the mechanics of electoral policy. People who have kids that are going to college, have you thought about figuring out whether they can vote in their college town, or should they be getting an absentee ballot? How do you do that? This is what responsible citizens do. If we're not thinking about these things, if we're not doing these things, no matter what we think about democracy, we're not actually doing democracy.
Yeah, 1,000%. And we need to register more people and motivate them to vote. And what the Christian right is so powerful about is if there's a pastor who says they're an apostle and get direct revelations from God, and they can cast out demons and do faith healings, if they say you need to be spiritual warriors and recruit people to vote and drive them, during election day or whatever, they go and do it. Period. It's not an option for them in their minds. And the rest of us are, like, maybe I can get around to getting over there to cast my ballot. No, no, no.
Oh, I understand that not everybody's a robot here, right? But it's the theology that they've embraced. It's like, you're not just but when you're working for a candidate, it's not just some lawyer or some real estate developer who's advancing their career, their personal ambitions, says good things. Maybe he's a good guy, who knows? Right. But no. You may have the lawyers and the real estate developers and other kinds of educated leaders, but you're not voting for an individual. You're advancing the kingdom of God. It's a transcendent vision of what you're doing, and it's powerful and it's exciting. This is why democracy is hard. How do we envision democracy in a transcendent way in which we're all in this together, and that means something, right? And the kinds of tactics we're talking about with foreign interests and cults and theocratic groups are intended to pit us against one another, right? Yep. And so that minority factions can have disproportionate influence and power in our democratic institutions. This is what we've seen in the Congress. This is what we've seen in many state legislatures. And it's an extraordinary thing to see. And but it doesn't have to be that way. To be a little bit black and white about these things, there are more of us than there are of them. And
a lot more.
If you study the data, as I have, you can see that. But what they know, and this is part of Gary North's notion of the dilemma, right, is it's very hard for the people who support democratic pluralism to mobilize against the people who don't.
Yep. And we need to pay attention to history. Now we're in a period with Vladimir Putin exercising his dictatorial powers to mobilize a vast military presence against unarmed citizens to take over Ukraine. And people are outraged at that, but it's the same mindset, really, about a malignant narcissist saying he knows better for humanity what needs to happen, and it doesn't matter who dies or how much money is expended or whatever. And it's not normal thinking. It's not rational thinking. It's ideologically tinged in a way that's going to cause so much harm.
Mm-hmm. Do you have that quote I sent you, the Gary North quote,
Candy? Yes, I was going to read it, man.
Yes, please do.
You were reading my mind. So Gary North in the 80s, and this is a quote from your book, Eternal Hostility, page 120. You quote Gary North explaining how it's necessary for conservative Christians to, quote, exploit the doctrine of religious liberty to gain independence for Christian schools until we train up a generation of people who know that there is no religious neutrality. Then they will get busy constructing a Bible-based social, political, and religious order which finally denies religious liberty to the enemies of God. This is a direct quote of Gary North, who is one of the major, in my mind, propagandists for this point of view. And he's saying we're going to take away the rights of others to impose our version of reality on them.
Well, that's right. So we've talked about the Manhattan Declaration and what religious freedom means. This is Gary North decades before the Manhattan Declaration, and even before Francis Schaeffer was talking about co-belligerency and all that stuff. The idea of exploiting religious freedom, saying, "Oh yeah, we're for religious freedom. We're all Americans. We're for religious freedom here," but the idea of using it, right, in order to end the religious freedom of others, that's an idea that's hard for most people of goodwill to get your mind around. Oh no, nobody could be that cynical, but that's not cynicism, right? That's strategy, right?
100%.
And he understands, that they're in a war for the world. Andrew Womack and the leaders of Charis Bible College at the Dominionists understand that they're in a war for the world. And the war, might conclude sooner and might conclude later, but it's a war nevertheless. And so the kinds of tactics that we see, such as exploiting the idea of religious freedom, using the tools of democracy in order to end it, this is the story of our time. It's not some other story. It's this story.
Right.
And so when he says there is no neutrality, right, when it comes to religion, that's what he means. There's only one true religion. And he's being a little bit ecumenical there, in the sense that there's sort of a broad group of people he would consider acceptable, but the people who fall outside of that are the enemies of God. They're not entitled to religious liberty. Right?
It's the ends justify the means, Fred. And I can't help but go historical for a minute and state that, Adolf Hitler wrote what he believed in Mein Kampf. Gary North wrote what he believed and what he's been pushing and has been pushed for decades. And Hitler was voted into power, and there was a very small number of people in Germany that were Hitlerites, but he took over the country.
Well, that's right. As we don't mean to compare these guys to Hitler, but the idea that it's possible to use the openness of society in order to close it is certainly true in history, and that's what we're seeing happening, and it's not hard to see. So. But again, I am hopeful in all of this, because I say there are more of us than there are of them. The trick is, how do the rest of us get sufficiently organized to counter these things? And we still have, free speech. We still have freedom of religion. We still have free speech. We still have a relatively free press. And, we still have the institutions of democracy working. Right. The intent is for some of them is to throw monkey wrenches into the system, so that it doesn't work. Let's figure out how to make them work better. Let's make sure that they keep running properly. We see an awful lot of doomsaying in the media, but this is far from over.
Right.
Our institutions are still pretty resilient, threatened to be sure, but resilient nevertheless. And it's the obligation of the rest of us to know enough about who opposes these things, and know enough about the institutions themselves, like the mechanics of voting that I talked about. This is what it means to be a citizen in our time. If we value religious freedom, if we value democracy, we have to know what religious freedom is.
Yep. 100%. I want to add, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about the role of tech and social media. I remember interviewing the man who wrote the book on the New Apostolic Reformation. Was his name Weaver? I'm not remembering the name of him. Anyway, that this movement of millions of people around the world are very high tech, very advanced, and with algorithms, people can be fed tainted information or distorted information to reflect their previous preferences, etc. And unless people get off screens and realize that there's this other thing happening through our computers and smartphones, and that we need to be open to other points of view, but we need to decide whether the sources of information are trustworthy, whether the information has evidence to it and not just fear or emotionalism. Say something about that, if you don't mind.
Well, sure. Being discerning media consumers is a part of the skill set of democracy too, and it's it's an advanced, set of tools, and it's probably not for everybody. But if we expect our institutional leaders, our political leaders, our religious leaders, our educators, to at least be, schooled enough themselves so that they can help us to make wise choices in what we view, how we're to understand it. Even our favorite media is not always the best, and we have to learn to be healthy consumers of everything. And because there is no one pure source, and it doesn't matter what your political or religious point of view is. All institutions, all human institutions are imperfect,
Yep.
including us as consumers. So that kind of needs to be built into the fabric of things. So a lot of skepticism and a lot of humility, but not to let those things get in the way of positive, forward-looking social and political action. Because if it's one thing to be saying, they're all a bunch of liars, or they're all politicians, they're all no good, or my way or the highway kind of thinking, that isn't going to help us.
Not at all. So I can't let you go, Fred, without asking you to at least spend a couple of minutes talking about Jefferson and Madison and the original intention of the framers of our Constitution.
Sure.
Please.
Yeah, it's something I spent a lot of time on, as you know, and because many years ago when I was in Reagan's Washington and hearing people talk about, well, America was founded as a Christian nation, I thought, well, I don't think that's quite right, but I didn't have a good answer.
Right.
And I spent many years trying to get the right answers, read around and, and went to Monticello and read about the life of Jefferson and all these things. And, Jefferson and Madison in their time were contending with an established church, the Anglican Church, which was a religious cultural arm of the British Empire, who's the King of England was at the head of it.
Right.
And, in Virginia, you had to be married in an Anglican church, which you had to pay, right, a lot. And you couldn't necessarily be a member of the Anglican Church, so they were very selective, and it was run by the landed gentry. And so if you were a Baptist, right, Baptists were persecuted and beaten. There's like a famous painting of like deputized elders from the Anglican Church going out and beating the crap out of somebody who was a Baptist preacher. And they would humiliate Baptists by mocking the ritual of water immersion as a form of baptism, by holding their heads underwater, essentially waterboarding them.
Wow.
And that was common practice in mid-18th century Virginia. So the totalitarianism of the Anglican Church, right, restricting who could be married and where and under what circumstances and how to practice, your religion, and which religions were even acceptable. That was the norm. And so the Baptists and the Presbyterian minority, needed to be talked into, what's in it for me in this revolution you're talking about. And Jefferson promised them religious freedom. We're going to get you religious freedom and equality. And that was part of the politics of Virginia at the time, was to figure out how to do that, how to say it, what it would mean, who would apply to. And so Jefferson coming after drafting the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, he gets back home and he starts drafting the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It took 10 years to get it passed under the leadership of James Madison in the legislature. But the key point in it is that your religious identity, right, should be neither an advantage or a disadvantage in your status as a citizen.
Say that again.
Okay, I can't quote you the 18th century language, but the
Right.
21st century meaning, right,
Yep.
is that your identity, your religious identity or lack of religious identity should be neither an advantage or a disadvantage in your status as a citizen. Now, James Madison, having just gotten this through the Virginia legislature, gotten it signed into law, then, the very next year, traveled to Philadelphia, where he was the principal, not the only, but the principal author of the Constitution. And then later of the First Amendment during the first Congress. So the idea of this independence of thought that should be free from the undue influence of powerful religious institutions in the government is the absolute core idea about religious freedom means, as Jefferson and Madison intended it. There were Enlightenment kind of thinking that came into that, but there was also traditional Baptist kind of thinking, the idea of soul freedom. And that's the basis of the philosophy of religious freedom in the United States, not something else, it's that.
Yeah,
freedom
and there's your conscience.
That's right. Madison and Jefferson sort of had synonymous phrases for religious freedom. I think it was Jefferson who also used freedom of the mind.
Freedom of the mind. I like that one.
Right.
That's
right. And I think it was Madison who used the phrase "the right of individual conscience." So freedom of the mind is sort of the enlightened wing of the thinking, and freedom and the right of individual conscience is sort of the Baptist wing of the philosophy.
Interesting.
And so yeah, to know that history and to embrace it, right? So religious freedom shouldn't be something complicated, but it's actually something very simple. And so when there's a lot of hocus pocus and razzmatazz and reinterpretation and revisionist history going on, you could just cut right through that, because it's this and it's not something else. And all of the framers of the Constitution knew this. And the people who didn't like this idea, well, America's Constitution ought to be a Christian nation. Well, the Constitution doesn't acknowledge God, right? They opposed, the Christian right of the 18th century opposed the ratification of the Constitution in the state legislatures. They didn't like it then, they don't like it now.
I can't, when I listen to some of the folks saying, we were a Christian nation, we need to go back to the way things were. What I learned from you is it's Anglican church only. If they really want to go back to, those days, before the Constitution, it was the Constitution that kind of set us apart from that ideology.
Well, yeah, it wasn't the Anglican Church everywhere, but there were established churches in each of the colonies.
Right.
So if you're the framers of the Constitution, how are you going to reconcile these different Christian sects, including the totalitarian Anglican Church that they just had a revolution to throw off, right? How do you do that? And the way that they did that, the way they threaded the needle, was to give the right of religious freedom to individuals and not the institutions, and certainly not to the state.
Right. Great. Fred, you're a gem. You're a resource for all. And I want to give you the last word. Any final thoughts you'd like to add, close off on?
Sure. Now is the time, right? Now is the time. And where, one of the things that Jefferson and Madison also talked about is like I said earlier, they knew that the monarchists and the theocrats would be back, and they are, powerfully so. We need to think of ourselves, not in some romanticized or nostalgic or grandiose kind of way, but we need to think of ourselves as the founders. The American experiment is about reinventing it as we go along. And the fundamental definition of who we'd like to be is being defined by people who really oppose what we'd like to be. So everybody who's able needs to think of themselves as the founders. We're beginning right now for the 21st century of America.
Yeah, empowerment of the individual. Don't turn over your power to some external authority figure, or whether it's a pastor or a political figure or an ideology even. You need to use your conscience and your common sense.
Well, sure. And also keep in mind, lest we sound too individualistic, too libertarian here, that while the right of individual conscience, is important, and that's the right given to us in the Constitution and the First Amendment, we're all in this together.
Yes.
My religious freedom depends on your religious freedom and my respect for it, because that is how democratic pluralism survives and thrives. And it's not just about education, interfaith education, dialogues. Those are good things, and they're a step, but it's not the same thing as in a wider democratic, electoral, and cultural sense to embrace the pluralism. And it's like the original motto of the country, e pluribus unum,
Right.
out of many, one. We're still many in order to achieve the one. So that's where we still need to be. It's different, in our time than it was in the 18th century,
Right.
but it's our job to invent it.
Yep, that's wonderful. I'm so grateful to your work. I want to just add
Likewise.
the power of former members, coming back to the beginning of our talk, the
Mm-hmm.
power of former members who have lost our freedom or were raised in an authoritarian religious cult. And then waking up and realizing, you know what, there's more to life than this black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil, simplistic, fear-based, involvement. There's a movement of former members. They're ex-evangelicals, people who are saying, no, this is wrong. Conversion therapy is wrong. I'm gay, and I need to be me. And opening up our minds to the fact that we are all in this together. We're all on planet Earth together, and we have to take care of each other if we want to survive.
Well, that's right. Like I said, nobody understands religious freedom better, or at least, they may not have the words, but they certainly know what it means, as if they never had religious freedom, but now they do, or if it was taken away in some cultic, scheme.
Exactly. So I'm part of a movement of ex-members. We're doing a hashtag I got out as an effort to try to destigmatize the fact that, you don't have to be, uneducated or stupid to have been deceived into and mind controlled into a cult like I was. That good people get co-opted and there's life after cult. So the more people who are willing to share their stories, I think we can destigmatize it. And I think there are tens of millions of Americans that have stories to share that are invaluable to preserve our liberty.
Well, I think so. And, in your work, you've talked about abusive relationships that people get stuck in, and there's cultic aspects to that. So there are lots of people who know what it means to have their freedom taken away and to having been essentially psychological prisoners in certain situations, but then to be free from them. And everybody's idea of the freedom, the escape from those sorts of environments have a lot in common. And that, and know what it means to lose, your dignity and your freedom. And those are lessons that need to be applied broadly, right?
Yeah.
To defend, the freedom for all of us against those who really are opposed to it and are gaining political power in our time.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to you, Fred. Thank you so much. Stay healthy, stay in touch, and
Will do.
thanks so
Yep.
much.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
My pleasure.